The mountains still wore snow like a shawl, draped white and silent across the ridgelines of Utah territory. Wind threaded down the valley, cold and thin as a knife's edge, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a spring that seemed reluctant to arrive. Thatcher Kane had spent the morning splitting logs near the barn. Sleeves rolled despite the chill, the rhythmic thud of axe on wood, the only sound around for miles. He was a man built for solitude. Broad-shouldered and lean, with hands scarred from 15 years of ranch work done entirely alone. His face carried the weather of hard winters and harder memories, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. Those who knew him in town, the few who still remembered, said he'd been different once. Lighter, a man who smiled. Easy and spoke of the future like it was something worth planning. For that was before the war took his wife. Before the letter came telling him she died in a field hospital in France, blown apart by a shell on a quiet morning while tending to wounded soldiers. Before he'd folded that letter, placed it in a drawer, and decided that caring for anything beyond cattle and fence posts was a luxury he could no longer afford, he reached for another pine round when movement caught his eye. Far down the muddy road, a figure approached. A woman, he realized with a start. Mid-20s, maybe. Mud clung to the hem of her skirt in heavy clumps, and the heel of one boot dragged behind like a wounded limb. Her suitcase bumped unevenly over the ruts in the road, its leather edges battered and soft with wear. A gust of wind caught her bonnet, nearly tore it loose. She grabbed it with one gloved hand, not stopping, not even slowing. Just kept coming with a determination that spoke of someone who'd already come too far to turn back now. Thatcher straightened slowly, the axe growing heavy in his hand. Visitors were rare. Visitors on foot, alone, were unheard of. The nearest town was 6 miles south, and the road from there was unforgiving in early spring. She reached the fence and stopped. The wind tugged at her coat, too thin for this place, too light for a spring that still carried teeth. Their eyes met across the distance of split rail fence and 15 years of grief. He said nothing. Her voice, when it came, was dry, cracked with wind and travel. "Mr. Kane?" He gave a slight nod, uncertain. "I'm Eloise Mercer," she said, each word deliberate and careful. "I believe I'm your mail-order bride." The words didn't quite settle. They hung there like smoke from a distant fire, drifting and impossible to grasp. Thatcher blinked, certain he'd misheard. The wind howled between them. "You're what?" She fumbled in her coat, pulled out an envelope. The paper looked like it had been folded and unfolded a dozen times, softened by nervous fingers and uncertain hope. She held it across the fence, not pleading, just steady. "Waiting. It's from Matrimonial Matches in Omaha," she said. "Signed with your name. Your ranch address. Everything." He took it slowly, like it might bite. The signature looked familiar, but the strokes were too careful, too measured. His name, Thatcher Kane, was there in neat black ink, but it wasn't his hand. It was a mask worn by someone who knew just enough to fool a stranger. "This isn't mine," he said flatly. She didn't look surprised. If anything, her shoulders dropped the smallest inch, like she'd been bracing for exactly this. "I figured," she murmured. "But it was real enough to get me here." The wind picked up. Her coat flared around her legs. She clutched the handle of the suitcase a little tighter, knuckles white through worn gloves. "I left everything," she said, and her voice had thinned just slightly. "Job, room, the few friends I had. Spent what I had on that train ticket." Her gaze shifted up toward the ridgeline, then back to the fence between them. "There's no one waiting for me back east. And apparently no one here either." She didn't beg, didn't demand, just stated it plain, the way you'd state that winter was cold or that fire burned. Her shoulders straightened again, some inner steel reasserting itself. She lowered her eyes. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Kane." Then she turned, slow and resigned, and started back down the road she'd just climbed. He watched her go. Watched the way she moved, like she'd already accepted being turned away. Not hurt, not angry. Just used to it. Used to doors closing. Used to being the mistake nobody wanted to fix. Something in that walk, that quiet, defeated acceptance, cracked something. In his chest, he'd thought was sealed shut for good. He let out a long breath through his nose. "Wait." She stopped. Turned halfway, eyes guarded, waiting for the second rejection that would finish what the first had started. He nodded toward the cabin. "Storm will roll in by dark. You'll sleep inside." She blinked. "Inside? I'll take the chair. You can sleep near the stove." A pause. Then he added, "Just for tonight." Her jaw tightened. She hesitated, studying him like she was trying to read a language she'd never quite learned. Then finally, she nodded once. He unlatched the gate and stepped back. She passed through, careful not to touch him, careful to keep distance between them like it was a rule she'd learned the hard way. They walked toward the cabin, boots crunching cold gravel. Neither spoke. 15 years since he'd shared a roof with anyone. Tonight, the silence would be broken by 2 sets of footsteps on the wood floor. 2 shadows cast by the same fire, and Thatcher Kane, who hadn't let anyone close enough to matter in more than a decade, felt the first tremor of something he couldn't name. Something that felt dangerously like Hope. Part 2. The weight of silence. The morning frost clung to the windows when Eloise rose. She dressed quickly in the dim light of dawn, knotted her hair at the nape of her neck, and stepped out into the yard before sunrise painted the sky. She didn't ask what needed doing. She simply started doing it. By the time Thatcher stepped outside, the front porch was swept clean. The hens were fed and clucking contentedly, and the kettle on the stove was whistling softly through the open door. She greeted him with a quiet nod, not cheerful, not distant, just enough to acknowledge his presence without disturbing the silence. He seemed to wear like armor. He nodded back and walked to the barn without a word. That's how the days went. Eloise worked, and Thatcher let her. She cleaned the corners of the cabin he hadn't touched in years, patched the curtains with thread she found in a forgotten basket, mended the loose hinge on the pantry door. At night, she cooked without fuss. Simple food stew, cornbread, boiled beans with salt pork. Thatcher ate without complaint, but he never lingered. They never ate at the same time. Once, Eloise left a warm plate on the table before heading out to fetch water from the well. When she returned, the plate was empty, washed, dried, and set back on the shelf. No comment. No thank you. She didn't mind. Not really. What puzzled her wasn't what he said. It was what he did when he thought she wouldn't notice. One morning, she came in from feeding the goats, soaked through from sudden rain. A clean, dry coat was hanging from the peg by the door. His, not hers. She knew because it smelled like wood smoke and leather and the particular soap he used that left his hands. Clean but never soft. Another time, when she coughed through the night a dry, rattling thing that kept her awake past midnight, she woke to find a pot of hot water simmering on the stove and a tin of old peppermint tea beside her cup. The tin was dusty, like it had been stored away for years, save for some occasion that never came. But Thatcher Kane never once looked her in the eye longer than a second. Never asked how she was sleeping. Never stood close enough to brush shoulders in the narrow kitchen. It was as if he lived on the edges of his own home, letting her occupy the center only as long as she didn't ask why. Eloise was used to quiet men, the kind who buried their grief under layers of pride and practicality. But this was something else. Thatcher didn't just avoid affection. He avoided proximity, contact. The simple human warmth of standing too close or letting a hand linger a moment too long. She began to wonder what he was running from. Or who thought one evening, after a long day repairing the chicken coop, Eloise sat on the porch, her boots caked in dried mud, hands raw from hammering. Thatcher stood near the hitching post, brushing down the old Bay Mare. His back was to her, shoulders tense, movements practiced and methodical. She spoke quietly, her voice barely reaching over the sounds of wind and horse. "Do you always treat your guests like ghosts, Mr. Kane?" He paused, the brush stilled in his hand. But he didn't turn. "You're not a guest," he said. That stung, sharper than she expected. "I see," she replied, folding her arms against the chill. "A mistake, then." He still didn't turn. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then, after a long pause, she asked, "Do you think I'm here because I want to be pitied?" No. Her eyes flicked toward him, searching the line of his shoulders for something: anger, dismissal, anything she could read. Then why the silence? The distance? She stood, took a step forward. Not enough to crowd him, just enough to be seen clearly. "You've had every chance to send me away." Finally, he turned, but only part way. His profile was sharp against the dimming light, jaw set, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. Eloise stood her ground, studying his face. Worn, weathered, but not cruel. There was something else there, buried deep. Something that looked like fear. "If I wasn't meant to be here," she said, voice steady, "why haven't you sent me away?" The question lingered in the air like wood smoke. Thatcher met her gaze, really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. Something shifted behind his eyes. Something buried and tightly held, like a fist clenched around broken glass. But he didn't answer. He simply looked at her for one long, unguarded moment. Then turned back to the horse, continuing the brushstrokes like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just asked the one question he couldn't answer. Eloise didn't push. But as she returned inside, closing the door behind her, the silence felt different, not emptier. Just waiting. Part 3. The fever and the breaking, the wind howled low through the pines that night, dragging the cold down from the mountains like a ghost searching for a door left unlatched. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled but gave little heat. Thatcher sat alone at the table, staring at his supper gone cold. He hadn't seen Eloise all afternoon. She'd gone to the creek early to wash linens and hadn't come back with her usual quiet hum, or the scent of lavender soap trailing behind her. Something felt wrong. He finally knocked at her door. 3 slow raps. "Miss Mercer?" No reply. He opened the door a crack. She lay curled on the bed, her face pale and damp with sweat. Her breath was shallow, her lips dry and cracked. The basin by the bed was full of untouched water, and the wet linen she'd tried to wash lay forgotten on the floor. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. Her skin burned under his touch, hot like coals banked beneath ash. He froze, realizing what he'd just done. He was touching someone. His first instinct was to pull away, to retreat to the safety of distance. But he didn't single quotes T. Instead, he drew the chair closer to her bedside, and he stayed, years earlier. A different room, a different world. Thatcher stood in a crowded train station, the letter in his hand trembling. "We regret to inform you... She'd gone to France. Volunteered as a nurse. Promised to come home. She never did. The shell hit the field hospital on a quiet morning. No warning. No survivors. He remembered the last thing she'd said before leaving. You always think you'll get to say goodbye. But you don't, not really. He hadn't touched anyone since, because the last person he loved died the moment he let her go. And some part of him, twisted, broken, believed it was his fault. That love was a curse he carried. That everyone he cared for was marked for tragedy. That night, as Eloise burned through her fever, Thatcher placed a damp cloth on her forehead. Changed it every hour. He didn't sleep, didn't move from that chair. Her hands twisted in the sheets. Her lips murmured names, some real, some imagined. Then a sentence that struck him like thunder. "Get off me, please. No, don't." Thatcher leaned forward, voice low and urgent. "You're safe. No one here will touch you. You're safe, Miss Mercer." She whimpered, then stilled. He couldn't stop his hand this time. He reached down, took her hand in his. It was small, work-worn, calloused from scrubbing floors and feeding animals. But warm, alive, and he held on like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. By dawn, the fever broke. Eloise stirred, eyes fluttering open. Her breath came slow, her gaze unfocused. He let go of her hand as if it burned him. But not fast enough. She saw, and for the first time since arriving, her voice cracked with something more than politeness. "You stayed." Thatcher stood, cleared his throat, looked anywhere but at her face. "It's not safe to sleep through a fever. You needed water. I made sure." Silence passed between them. Heavy, but not cold. Then she said quietly, "I thought I was going to die." He didn't answer. "Before this," she continued, voice barely above a whisper, "I worked at a roadside inn. They bought me after my parents died. Called it an apprenticeship, but it was just labor. And when the owner got drunk, She didn't finish. She didn't need to. I hid in the back of a supply cart and jumped the tracks west when I got the chance." Thatcher looked at the floor, jaw working. "You never told me. You never asked." More silence. Then his voice, quieter than before. "My wife was a nurse. She died in the war." Eloise nodded slowly. "I wondered. You walk like a man who's been left behind." They didn't cry, didn't fall into each other's arms. But something passed between them. Recognition. The way broken people recognize the shape of someone else's grief. That night, when Eloise finally drifted back into restful sleep, Thatcher sat by the hearth, watching the last embers die. His hand still remembered hers, and for the first time in 15 years, he didn't feel cursed for surviving. He just felt human. Part 4. The truth uncovered. The town of Millwater sat cradled in a bowl of pines and red clay, 2 days' ride from Thatcher's ranch. He came in only when necessity demanded nails, salt, medicine for the cattle. He slipped into the general store, hat low, shoulders drawn inward. In a town like this, solitude made you conspicuous. At the counter, the shopkeeper paused, seeing the familiar silhouette. "Kane," he said, voice casual but sharpened with curiosity. "Heard there's big news in your direction." Thatcher's hand froze over the sack of salt. "What news?" The man tipped his head a little, eyes glinting. "Word is you asked for a bride. Mail order. Came in on the coach some weeks back. They say she's fair, well-spoken." His eyes flicked to Thatcher's face, searching for reaction. "That true?" Thatcher said nothing. He paid, collected his parcels, and walked out. The wind caught at his coat, tugged at the brim of his hat. Outside, whispers trailed him like dust kicked up by passing horses. He didn't ride straight home. He turned north, past the quarry, over ridges where the pines thinned and rock showed through earth. Jake Monroe's pasture lay ahead, fence lines pale in the dusk. Jake Monroe was there, skinning a deer beside a shed. He glanced up, blood on his hands, and something like amusement crossed his weathered face. "Well now," Jake said, "if it isn't the ghost of Cain, come out for provisions." Thatcher dismounted quietly. The board creaked under his boot. "Don't dance around it," Thatcher said. "You sent the letter." Jake stiffened. He set down his knife slowly, wiped his hands on a rag. "What letter?" "The one with my name. Asking for a wife. Signature, address, the whole thing." Jake's eyes narrowed. He spat on the ground. "You think I meant harm? I think you had no right." Jake laughed, bitter and sharp. "I had every right. You've sat silent long enough, Thatcher. No woman in your life. No future. Just you and that empty house and all those ghosts you won't let go." He stepped closer. "I thought she might light something in you. Bring you back." "You had no right," Thatcher repeated, voice tight as wire. "I had every right," Jake shot back. "You lost her and you lost yourself. I tried to bring something back before you rotted entirely in that silence." Thatcher shook his head, turned, and walked away. Jake's words echoed behind him, carried on the wind like accusation and apology all tangled together. On the return ride, the mountains closed in like watchful walls. The sky was bruised purple. The wind carried the scent of pine and regret. And Eloise, her name, her calm and haunted face, haunted him more than the ghosts of war ever did. He reached home as the last light slipped away. The cabin glowed faint through its windows. Smoke curled from the chimney. He dismounted and paused, listening to the crackle of fire, the soft sounds of life inside. Through the window, he saw her. Eloise sat on the floor near the hearth, basket and mending in her lap. Her face was pale in the firelight. The shirt she held was his, torn at the shoulder. She broke the silence when he entered. "It tore here," she said softly, holding up the fabric. "I thought you'd want it mended before the cold turned sharper." He stayed at the threshold, hat in hand, fists tight at his sides. The betrayal, the lie, the false hope poured into someone else's letter. It all pressed against his chest like a stone. She looked toward him, then back at the shirt. "I didn't ask to be here," she whispered. "But since I am, might as well do something useful." He didn't answer. He closed the door behind him, coat sliding off his shoulders. He sat at the table, unlit lantern between them. The soft shadows wavered. Eloise passed him a loaf of bread, her hand steady. He reached out, took it, looked up, met her eyes. She didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze, and under that quiet exchange, something in his cold heart cracked clean through. Part 5. The choice to stay the morning after the truth broke like a cracked plank. The silence in the cabin felt different. Not angry, not cold. Just waiting. Thatcher fixed fence posts and boiled coffee in the tin kettle, then cleared his throat. "About the letter," he said. Eloise looked up from the hearth where she was folding dry towels. She said nothing, only waited. He didn't sit, just stood there, fingers twitching against his thigh. "I didn't send it. Jake did. Thought he was helping." "I figured," she said quietly. He blinked. "You did? You flinched the first time I touched your arm." She said it plain, without accusation. Men who want wives don't do that. He felt the flush crawl up his neck. "I didn't ask for you to come here," he said carefully. "But now that you're here, you deserve to know you can leave. You're not beholden." Eloise nodded slowly, then stood, walked to the table, and placed the last folded towel down. "I didn't come here for a husband." He looked at her, genuinely confused. "I came for a chance," she said. "Not just to survive. To live, to matter to someone. To myself." Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did just a little. "I've cooked meals for strangers, washed floors for drunkards, hidden from hands that didn't ask permission. I've done the kind of living that drains you empty." She took a breath. "Here, I cook for one man who never touches me, who boils water when I cough, who leaves an extra pair of socks on the chair when the snow comes." He stared at her, not at the words, but at the way she said them, like truths scraped from the inside. "I want to stay," she said, "if you'll let me earn my keep." Thatcher felt something hard inside him give way, like dry earth after the first spring rain. "Then you stay," he said, "with wages and choice. Always your choice." From that day, things shifted like slow tectonic plates beneath their feet. Eloise moved through the cabin like she belonged, not because she was claimed, but because she claimed it for herself. She swept, patched, fed the hens, mucked the stalls. Thatcher built her a storage shelf, replaced the cracked window pane above her bed. And every evening, they ate dinner together. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just listened to the fire crackle and the wind play with the shutters down. One evening, the rain came down hard, thundering against the roof like hooves. The kind of storm that soaked through bones and memory. Eloise was writing something at the table. A letter maybe, or a list. Her hair was down. She didn't usually do that. Thatcher watched her from his chair, pretending to read. But the words on the page never registered. The fire dimmed. The kettle hissed. She had fallen asleep, head resting on her folded arms, the candle casting soft shadows over her face. He rose, slow and unsure. The blanket was draped over the settee. He took it, crossed the floor in soft-booted steps. When he reached her, she stirred but did not wake. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, tucking it gently beneath her arms. Then his hand moved, seemingly of its own accord. He brushed a strand of damp hair from her cheek. Her skin was warm. He did not flinch. For the first time in 15 years, Thatcher Kane touched another soul, not out of duty or defense, but out of something deeper. Something beginning to grow, one small trembling root at a time. Part 6. Standing ground spring had turned the dirt roads of Millwater into thick, sucking mud, but Thatcher rode in anyway. The list was short: flour, coffee, salt, new hinges, and cinnamon. She'd said it quietly that morning as she sliced bread near the stove. Only if it's not too dear. Not demanding. Not expectant. Just a passing wish, tucked between chores and silence. He had nodded once, already writing it down. The rain hadn't stopped since dawn. It slicked the roads and turned every step into a gamble. Thatcher moved through the town like he always did, shoulders set, hat low, coat buttoned against the world. Only now, the stairs didn't slide off him the way they used to. They stuck, longer, sharper. He was used to being left alone. That had been the point. But now, as he tied his horse outside Clara's store and stepped in, he felt the silent shift. Felt it gather like a storm behind every glance. Clara, as always, was behind the counter, sleeves rolled, ledger open. She glanced up when he laid the flour and coffee on the worn wood. Her eyes flicked to the jar of cinnamon in his hand. "Bringing sweets back for your girl?" she asked, voice casual. But it held a little edge, a little tilt of curiosity sharpened by the gossip that moved faster than any mail coach. Thatcher said nothing. Outside, as he walked toward the blacksmith's stall, voices rose behind his back. Mail order Huzzy walked in like she owned the place. Bet she's after the land. He kept moving. Mud tugged at his boots. Rain ran down the brim of his hat. His jaw was clenched so tight he could feel the ache in his Mo al-Azdad at the blacksmith's. He waited for hinges. Simple. Necessary. He heard the saloon doors swing. Footsteps heavy and unsteady. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," came the voice, thick with drink. Mick Dobbins. Drunk, loud, always looking for someone smaller to step on. "Heard you got yourself a housemaid with benefits, Kane. What did she cost you? A lie and a warm bed?" Laughter tight and force rippled from a few men nearby. Thatcher didn't react. Mick swaggered closer. "She earning her keep? Or just lying back and praying you ain't rusty?" The world went still. Then Thatcher stepped forward. No warning. No raised voice. Just one clean punched up Mick hit the mud with a thud and a grunt. He rolled onto his side, groaning, blood mixing with rainwater. Thatcher didn't look down. He turned to the bystanders, men who knew him, feared him, and now saw something different in him. "She's worth 10 of any man in this town," he said quietly. "And she's staying." No one answered. Only the rain, steady and cold. He walked back to his horse, slid the cinnamon into his saddlebag, and rode out of no water like he'd walked through fire and come out cleaner. Part 7. The photograph. The attic smelled of cedar and dust. Eloise stood at the threshold for a long moment before stepping inside, the creak of the old ladder fading behind her. She had come looking for a jar of nails, Thatcher mentioned, earlier that week. But what she found was something else entirely. In a box pushed under a moth-eaten quilt. She found a small wooden frame wrapped in faded linen. She unwrapped it slowly. A photograph. Black and white. Edges curled. A woman, young, strong-featured, standing beside Thatcher. They were both dressed in their Sunday best. He was smiling. Not the ghost of a smile he wore now, but a full, wide grin. The woman had her hand on his chest, and he had one arm around her waist like he had every right in the world to hold her. Eloise stared at the image for a long time. Later that evening, the jar of nails forgotten, she came down to the porch where Thatcher sat, polishing his boots. The sunset painted everything gold and copper, shadows long across the field. He looked up when she approached, eyes narrowing just slightly. She sat down beside him, quiet, the photograph cradled in her hands. "I found her," she said softly. "In the attic." Thatcher froze. The brush in his hands stilled mid-motion. "I wasn't snooping," she added quickly. "I was looking for nails." He gave a small nod, not meeting her eyes. Eloise looked down at the photo again. She was beautiful. He closed his eyes. "I thought you might be upset," he said after a moment. "Angry or hurt?" "I'm not," she said, handing the frame over. He took it, hands trembling faintly. "I'm not her," Eloise said quietly. "I never will be." Thatcher swallowed hard. "I know, but I can love you," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "In the way I know how." He stared down at the photograph, then at his hand scarred, sun-worn, calloused. "I never meant to let anyone in again," he said. "I thought if I didn't touch, didn't speak too much, didn't care, I wouldn't lose anything." Eloise folded her hands in her lap. "She didn't interrupt. She was killed by a shell," he said. "In the war. I got the letter 2 weeks after I'd written asking her to come west with me." His voice cracked. "I didn't even know she'd said yes." A long silence fell between them. "I kept thinking," he said, eyes on the photo, "that I was the curse, that everyone I care about gets taken. I thought if I lived quiet, alone, maybe I could outrun the bad luck." Eloise reached out then, not to touch, but to simply rest her hand on the edge of the bench near his. He looked at it, then at her. And then, finally, he broke. It wasn't loud. There were no sobs or gasps, just a slow, silent crumpling, shoulders hunched, chest shaking, breath catching on words he didn't say. Tears ran down the creases of his weathered face, dripping onto the boots he'd polished, until they shone like memory. Eloise moved closer. Not to smother, not to fix, but to be there, present, real. He didn't pull away, and when he finally looked up, eyes red-rimmed and glassy, he whispered, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For still being alive," he said, "when she isn't." Eloise blinked back her own tears. "You don't have to apologize. You lived. That's not a betrayal. That's a miracle." He let out a broken sound. Something like laughter. Something like relief. "I didn't know I needed to hear that," he said. She smiled, the corners of her lips trembling. "I think we all need reminding sometimes." that were allowed to keep going. Thatcher looked at the photo once more. Then gently, he set it aside. "I don't know how to start over," he admitted. "You don't have to," Eloise said. "Just start." He turned to her, really looked at her. The woman who had arrived by mistake. The woman who had stayed by choice. And for the first time, he didn't see a shadow of someone he lost. He saw her, Eloise, here, now, alive. Part 8. The right mistake. The first true signs of spring softened the edges of the Utah mountains. Patches of snow still clung to the north slopes, but the valleys had begun to green. The wind smelled like thawed earth and new grass. And the chickens had started laying again. In the kitchen of the small ranch house. Eloise stood by the window, one hand resting absently on the curve of her stomach. It wasn't a large bump yet. Just enough to round the front of her apron. Enough that the buttons of her coat no longer met in the middle. Enough that she sometimes caught Thatcher watching her with a quiet look she couldn't quite name. She poured water into a tin canteen, tucked 2 biscuits into a napkin, and stepped out onto the porch. Thatcher was at the west fence line, halfway through replacing a panel that had cracked during the last freeze. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing sun-darkened forearms, and his hat sat low on his brow as he hammered a new plank into place. He didn't hear her approach at first. Not until her boots crunched softly on the gravel path. She didn't call out. Just set the water and napkin on the table beside the tool chest, then stood for a moment, watching him work. He paused, glanced over, offered a quiet smile. "Thank you." She nodded. "You've been out here all morning." He shrugged. Felt good to fix something that stays fixed. She smiled at that. The dry humor she had come to expect. The way he said everything with fewer words than most people used to saying nothing. He set down the hammer and reached for the canteen. She watched as he drank slow, measured, then handed it back. Their fingers brushed. And for once, neither of them looked away. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without fanfare, he reached down and took her hand. Just that. No speeches. No trembling confessions. Just his calloused fingers wrapping around hers, grounding her. They stood like that for a long time. "I thought I'd live and die alone," Thatcher said finally, voice low and steady. "But you ... He gave a small, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "You were the one mistake I needed." Her throat tightened. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. She leaned forward and rested her forehead lightly against his chest. He pulled her in gently, the bump of her belly fitting between them like it belonged there. Because it did. They weren't perfect. They hadn't followed any map. But they had found something worth holding on to. Later that evening, the sky turned the color of ripe Apretrish contouri and the air smelled like rain. Eloise mounted her mare with practiced ease, swinging up into the saddle as Thatcher adjusted the stirrups on his gelding. He looked over at her, one brow raised. "You sure you're up for a ride?" She smirked. "I'm pregnant, not broken." He chuckled and nodded toward the fields. "Then let's go." They rode side by side into the open valley, the horses trotting slow and steady. The wind tugged at Eloise's hair, and she laughed, the sound clear and joyful. She turned her face toward the sunset, golden light bathing her skin, hand resting instinctively over her stomach. This wasn't the life she'd been promised. It wasn't the plan, but somehow it was better. She looked over at Thatcher. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, one hand resting lightly on the reins, the other close enough to brush hers as they rode. He caught her looking, and something passed between them. A kind of wordless promise. Not about forever. Not about perfection. Just this, that they would choose each other again and again. Even when it was hard. Even when it made no sense. Especially then. The horses slowed near a ridge overlooking the ranch. From here, They could see the cabin small and solid against the wilderness. Smoke curled from the chimney. The barn stood weathered but strong. The fence lines ran true. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Thatcher dismounted first, then helped Eloise down. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and she didn't pull away. They stood together on that ridge, watching the sun sink below the mountains. The sky blazed orange and pink, then deepened to purple. The first stars appeared like promises written in light. "Thank you," Eloise said softly. "For what?" "For not sending me away." Thatcher turned to face her fully. He reached up, cupped her face gently in his rough hands. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "I'm the one who should be thanking you," he said. "You came here by mistake and saved my life." She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Then I guess we saved each other." He leaned down, pressed his forehead to hers. They breathed together in the cooling evening air. Two people who had been broken and lost, now found. The wind whispered through the pines. The horses grazed nearby. And for the first time in 15 years, Thatcher Kane felt the weight lift from his chest. The curse was broken not by forgetting, but by allowing himself to live again, to hope again, to love again. When they finally rode back to the cabin as darkness settled over the valley, they did so hand in hand. The lamplight glowed warm through the windows, welcoming them home. Inside, Thatcher built up the fire while Eloise prepared a simple supper. They moved around each other with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms, who had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. After they ate, they sat together on the old settee near the hearth. Eloise leaned against Thatcher's shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. His hand rested gently on the small swell of her belly, feeling the new life growing there, a future neither of them had dared to imagine. "What should we name the baby?" Eloise asked drowsily. Thatcher was quiet for a moment, considering. "If it's a girl, maybe Grace, for the grace that brought you here." Eloise smiled. "And if it's a boy?" "Samuel. It means God has heard. Because maybe, after all this time, somebody was listening." She turned her face up to his, and he kissed her. Soft and slow. A kiss that tasted like forgiveness and new beginnings and all the tomorrows they'd been too afraid to believe in. When they finally pulled apart, Eloise whispered, "I love you, Thatcher Kane." His eyes glistened in the firelight. "I love you too, Eloise. More than I thought I'd ever be able to love anyone again." They sat there until the fire burned low and the night grew deep. Two souls who had wandered through their own wildernesses and somehow found their way to each other. The letter had been a lie. The circumstances had been a mistake. But what grew between them was the truest thing either of them had ever known. Outside, the Utah mountains stood silent and eternal. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. And in a small cabin in a remote valley, two people who had been alone for far too long finally found home. Not in the place, but in each other. The end.